Today, I'm talking about techniques that add depth and texture to your art journal pages. And I'm going to demonstrate the one technique that I get asked about the most. So, what can you do with paper? What can you do to paper to add depth and texture to it? Before I get into the techniques, I want to talk about the why first. Why would you be interested in adding texture to a page? What would be the purpose of this? And there's actually a couple of good reasons why this is interesting. The first reason is for visual interest. Texture draws a viewer's attention. A collage with depth and texture is more visually interesting and holds the gaze of a viewer for longer. The second reason is for a tactile experience. When a person can touch or feel the texture in your artwork, it creates a more engaging and memorable connection. The physical interaction with an art page can make it more meaningful. All right, I have 4 journals on my desk and examples to show you of techniques that demonstrate texture and depth. So I will start with this one. So this journal was made by Jane Chip. She is an absolutely fabulous artist who does all kinds of wonderful journals with vintage images and vintage papers. So this is an English-Ukrainian dictionary that's been altered. And the first thing that I want to point out is this piece of silk that's used to reinforce the spine, possibly, but also as a real contrast to the paper that is the cover. So that is my first example. In addition, we have this little bit of stitching, and also the use of a ribbon is a really good technique for showing the contrast between papers. In addition to the silk here, there's also silk put it between both pages to just kind of give this little bit of something that sticks out with the fray. Really effective. I love that. Here she's done some inking, probably with a sponge, but there's also some use of a stencil with some modeling paste. So you can feel the way the modeling paste stands out from the page. Now, things like photographs often can have a glossy finish to them, and that's what this photo is. It has a shine and it is different from the paper that's behind it. So this is a good example of something that is a good technique to use. Here we have some more silk and some stitching on that silk as well. Here, this is craft paper. Now this craft paper has been crumpled up and then straightened out. And since it has all these creases, it has this surface that is bumpy and different from the page that is behind it. This is being used as a pocket. This is a film strip that is stuck inside the little pocket or container that is used to preserve it, I suppose. And the whole thing is glued onto the page, which is very clever. So it has a completely different feel, of course, than the paper. More silk between pages. Here's also between these 2 pages is more craft paper, crumpled craft paper. Now, I don't know what the name of this material is. If I had to guess, I would say it's organza, but it's some kind of really super thin fabric, and she printed something on it, which makes this really awesome layering effect. I really love this. Here's another pocket with a tag, and there is this kind of thread also attached. Here's another ribbon. and more organza at the end. Anytime you also use a paper clip, this is a good idea to bring attention to something that you are holding into your journal page. And, you know, since it's a different texture than paper, it also is a standout. All right, the next journal I want to share with you is this junk journal. And the first technique that I want to highlight in this junk journal is one that's done with tissue paper. So let me open it up all the way. So tissue paper was used over the covers of this junk journal. And I'm not sure if you can see the way that it kind of bunches and creates these creases. And you definitely can feel it if you touch the surface. So you can see that those bumps are there, and then you can definitely feel it. So this with tissue paper is a very effective thing that you can do for adding texture to your pages, and in this case, a book cover page. So this is the technique that I get questions about all the time. So at the end, once I've shown all the journals, I will show you how I did this. But let's look through these pages. I won't go through all of it, but I do want to highlight some of these things. Now, this is a face of a watch, and on the back of it, I glued on this washer because I wanted to hold this photo into place. So I put a little magnet underneath this envelope cover, and now whatever I put here, I'm able to attach it with this watch face. So this is a good technique to add depth to your pages, and, you know, to add any interesting additional papers that you want to highlight. Here is another example with tissue paper. So in this case, I took a piece of tissue paper and I just folded it in half and used a little bit of glue stick in between to keep the pages together, and then used that as a book page. And it's also crinkled, and it has the sound that, you know, you can hear when you're turning a page, which is also a really nice effect. Here I've added a nice piece of lace to this page. It obviously has a distinct feel to it. And I think this one's actually been tea dyed as well, so it's a little bit even on the stiff side, as if it's been starched. Another thing that you can do is add embossed papers. So if you know, here's an example of paper that's been put on top of paper, but it's all completely flat. But embossed papers have a bumpy feel, of course, and it does add a different kind of texture to your page. In between these signatures, I added cheesecloth and some more ribbon, just because the space in between these signatures was actually quite big, and so I wanted to add some decorative element in there, so it wasn't quite so obvious. I wanted to make sure that my book would close properly and not be, you know, too spread out. And so I left a lot of space between these signatures. Here's another example of an interesting paper clip. And again, I'm just using it to attach papers together without using glue, right? It's just a way to add interest to the page. This is tissue paper, and I took a piece of book page and I wrapped it over the edge. It makes it easier to turn the page, first of all, but it's also a really nice contrast between the two types of papers. Now on here I have a piece of upholstery fabric, and then on top of the fabric is a piece of paper that has stitching on it. And all these things are very, very touchable. Here's another piece of lace. And I think that is everything that I want to show you out of this journal. Oh, here's an example of a doily. Doilies are fabulous. They, of course, have a very textured surface, and visually they are very appealing, especially if you can have different contrasting colors from your paper as to your doily. Very often doilies are tea-dyed, like I have this one here that's tea-dyed, but since my paper was already tea-dyed, I kept the doily in this kind of pure white so that there was a very high contrast between them. All right, the next journal I want to highlight is this fabric journal. Now, I've already talked about using fabric and using stitching. Another thing that is interesting to use is this, which is watercolor paper. Watercolor paper is pretty thick and it can hold all kinds of mediums, of course. I attached it into a signature using cloth and stitching. So I actually sewed onto the paper. I sewed the paper and the material together. That way it's easy to turn inside here. And otherwise it would have been too bulky. Here's another picture of, or another example of that watercolor paper. So here I have more upholstery fabric, I have lace, and here is more lace with a button on it. Now the other thing I wanted to point out is this Tyvek right here. This is a white piece of Tyvek and it has been colored with alcohol ink. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but alcohol ink goes really nicely into Tyvek. Tyvek is almost a kind of a fabric. It's a synthetic fabric, and it will hold alcohol ink really nicely, and the colors show up really vibrantly. And Tyvek has this smooth, very smooth feeling, which is so different from paper. So it's a really nice thing to add into your journal pages. Here on this piece of upholstery fabric, I have a bit of craft paper that's been crumpled up and sewn on. There's more lace. And over here, I found this piece of driftwood and I attached it to the fabric with wire, just copper wire with a little bit of beading. So, I mean, this is obviously a difficult thing to put into a journal page, but I made it work again so that my journal was not too stuffed too heavily, but that there was room specifically for it, right? I wanted to make sure that I had room for it. So there it is. Another thing that I've added here is a safety pin. So that is something else that you can thread onto a piece of paper or onto a cloth that you put into a journal. Okay, and is there anything else that I want to show you here? I think that's it. Okay. Now the last journal that I want to show you is this one. This is a journal that I made some years ago, and the technique that is really interesting here is that the whole thing was dunked in water. So this was an ordinary, it was a cover from a book, and it's been completely warped because it was soaking in water and then had to dry. Same with all of these papers. They were ordinary papers and then they got dunked in water all at the same time. it was actually a tea bath, if I remember correctly. But then in the process of drying, the texture completely changed. The color changed, everything about it changed. So that is what is so unique about this journal. Now inside on this first page, this is a dried flower, and obviously there is texture here. I don't want to touch it too much. It might pull off some of my little flowers. There's texture here that separates, kind of makes the contrast to this page. These reinforcers are I don't know, it's a type of a fabric, I guess. And so there's definitely a change of texture there. This is so completely crumpled and, you know, falling apart. It's a very fragile book, or at least it looks that way. The pages are holding up pretty fine, pretty much because I've layered, you know, so many things on top of one another that it becomes stiff with the thickness. Here's another example of a technique that you can use with these reinforcers. You can use pretty much anything. I've used some postage stamps, I've used tickets, regular reinforcers, and then there's also masking tape, which is another different kind of paper that can be used onto a surface. There's more ribbon. Here's more masking tape. Here is ribbon used as a reinforcer, and I wanted to show this page here. This is very, very interesting how it was put together. So this is an example of how to do that. So I've got it folded, and if say this is the page, I put this here like this, and then I can cut off the excess. See if I can do this quickly. So here's my page. I cut off the excess, and in order to add just the tiniest bit of contrast, I'm going to add some washi tape in there. Here I've added ribbon, this blue ribbon that's matched from the reinforcing side, but I will add a piece of washi tape to show what you can do. There. So you see how there's that little bit of difference there, and then now when you go ahead and put your holes, you have this whole bit of extra paper that is holding on to your page so that it won't fall out or fall apart, right? Lots of nice layers in there. Here's a nice example again of a photograph with a shiny surface. And here's some cloth. Now I have a few more examples of things that you can use in your journals. Here I have some clusters that I've just recently made, and using tea bag is such an interesting thing to do. Not only is it a different color depending on what kind of tea is in it, this was a black tea, but it is a contrast typically to the papers that you might be using, and that's a really nice thing. So tea bag is something that you can find pretty easily, and something that is fun to use for having a different texture in your pages. Another thing you can use is napkin, and depending on your background page, you want to remove some of the layers or not. If you start to separate this, it will be extremely thin, of course, and maybe that's the look that you're going for, but it could also be that it will be too transparent. So here's the thinnest layer here. So if I put glue on this, it might not show so well, being that it's a darker background. In that case, I would keep the white so that there's more of a contrast between the light and the dark background. So it all depends on, the look that you're going for. Now, the last thing I want to do is show you how I did this technique onto this cover. So I used tissue paper and an ordinary book page underneath. So say this is the book page that I want to use, and I want to glue it onto this cover and then use this over the top. So what I will do is just lightly. Now, tissue paper has a shiny side and it has a dull side. So I want the dull side to be facing the paper. So in this case, it's going to be shiny side up, because I want the glue to attach from this paper to this paper really well. So I have this matte medium, and what I want to do is add a little bit to a container where I can add some of this tea dye to the matte medium. There, I just put like 3 drops. I'm not sure how dark it's going to get, but I want to have it be, well, what I'll do is I'll put down a little bit and then see if it's dark enough, and if it's not, then I can always add a little bit more color. What's nice about these dyes is that you can play with any color you want. I wanted to go with something that kind of had a little bit of a vintage look to it, so that's what I'm going to do. So you start at the top or start at the bottom and put your matte medium on. That's a nice color. I like that. And then start with putting down your tissue paper over the top. And then you're going to put a layer on top of that as well. Now it's up to you how much you want it to crinkle, if you want it to crinkle a lot or crinkle a little bit. So now I will just continue with adding more of the matte medium over the tissue. Now I'm not paying too much close attention to the edges because I will probably cut this down or cut it out. So that's why I'm kind of being sloppy at the edges. So here's what the paper looks like when it's dry. There's a little bit of the crinkling down here at the bottom. It's kind of hard to see, but I can definitely feel it. This got dark because there was a crease from the paper and the ink kind of pooled in that one spot. So maybe that might be something that in the future I would kind of pay attention to, the crease. But overall, I liked the lighter colors that was used when I used more of the matte medium and less of the ink color. All right, so those are my examples of techniques that add depth and texture to your art journal pages. What I've done is created a list for you to print out and to keep it as a reminder of things that you could add to your journal pages. If there's anything that I may have forgotten, please let me know in the comments. I would love to hear your suggestions of other things that you have done that adds texture and depth. To see more of these journals, there is a link to a video that has a flip through of one of them.